China will never, ever, ever, ever forgive what Japan did to the Chinese people.
In terms of scale, Japanese atrocities spread across multiple countries. We didn't have just one Gaza. We had a Korea, we had a Manchuria, we had a Nanjing, we had a Manila.
Japan, the Israel of East Asia? No, my friend. If you look up Unit 731 and learn about the cruelty of the Japanese military, you might even end up thinking Israel was much better by comparison.
You've probably heard this online a lot. Japan is the Israel of Asia. Well, technically, it's East Asia, but I get the idea. You've seen this comparison everywhere, but it's not just wrong, it's dangerous, because it minimizes one of the most brutal campaigns of violence in human history. 20 million dead, 300,000 massacred in 6 weeks. Human experimentation on a scale that makes Nazi Germany look restrained, and zero accountability. Japan isn't the Israel of East Asia. The data shows it's infinitely worse. Let's get into it.
I think that Japan is walking on extremely thin ice in the provocations that they are currently allowing the US to manipulate them into making. I've spent a lot of time in China. I was there just a couple of weeks ago. There is visceral feelings about Japan in China. Of all of the countries of the world, China will never, ever, ever, ever forgive what Japan did to the Chinese people. They murdered more than 20 million Chinese. The war, which for us started in 1939 and for you started considerably further on than that, Japan invaded China in 1931 and didn't leave until their defeat in 1945. They further invaded other parts of China in 1936 and they killed 20 million Chinese people.
George hits the nail on the head. There is a visceral feeling about Japan and China, and it's not going away. He says Japan murdered more than 20 million Chinese people. Professor R.J. Rummel, a scholar of democide, that's murder by government, estimated that from 1937 to 1945, the Japanese military regime murdered between 3 and 10 million people, with a probable figure of almost 6 million Chinese, Indonesians, Koreans, Filipinos, and others. This wasn't just war, it was a policy of extermination. Let's check out some comments. China is very happy if Japan won a war so that China can settle the old scores. Not only China, the whole world. Chinese will never forget and never forgive Japanese. Just like me from Asia. US uses Ukraine to test Russian strength, and it has found out it is very powerful. Now US wants to test China too.
I've been seeing this comparison in my comment section a lot recently, and I completely agree with the sentiments. However, we should be very careful about making these kinds of comparisons in a way that would minimize the actual heinous war atrocities committed by the Japanese Imperial Army. Like, not to quote Zori Gilmore herself, but don't use other G-sides to describe this one. Because I can understand that what Japan and Is Not Real is doing is basically the same thing in different fonts. But it's important to acknowledge those differences, and we shouldn't let these comparisons overshadow what Japan actually did. First of all, the I word is a puppet state for the West. The I word was created by the West to legitimize their involvement in that area. The West has a special interest in that region, like oil, I would presume. But Japan during World War II was not a puppet state of the US. In fact, Japan got into imperialism as an appeal to whiteness. Japan worked hard at modernization and westernization so that they could sit at the same table as white leaders. Japan wanted to be the leaders of Asia, and they wanted to show that they could be one of the big guys. When Perry started knocking on all of our doors, Japan was the one who wanted to assimilate first. China and Korea rejected any ounce of Western culture infiltrating their countries. Meanwhile, I-word can do whatever they want. They don't need anyone's approval to continue doing what they're doing. Second of all, the G-side happening in Gaza is extremely densely concentrated. In terms of scale, Japanese atrocities spread across multiple countries. We didn't have just one Gaza. We had a Korea, we had a Manchuria, we had a Nanjing, we had a Manila. We also need to think about Taiwan, Okinawan people, Ainu people, Indonesian people, etc., etc. The list goes on and on. I'm not saying this to minimize what's currently going on, but I'm trying to emphasize just how many victims Japan created. I think this comparison between the I word and Japan is fitting in the sense that the injustices of the past are very much connected to the injustices of today. We shouldn't let these comparisons make us forget that the victims of the Japanese imperial government have their own unique experiences with suffering, and that's valid.
This is such a critical point. Don't use other genocides to describe this one. Japan wasn't a puppet state. It was a colonizing empire with ambitions to rule all of Asia. And the scale of their atrocities is something many in the West just don't comprehend. She mentions we didn't just have one Gaza. We had Korea, Manchuria, a Nanjing, a Manila. And she's absolutely right. The data backs this up. The Japanese democide wasn't confined to one area. It was a continent-spanning horror show. In the Philippines, the Japanese murdered nearly 14 out of every 1,000 people. In Indonesia, a minimum of 75,000 were killed in massacres. In Malaya, up to 100,000 were killed, with Chinese residents specifically targeted. This was a systemic effort to subjugate and brutalize an entire continent. To compare it to anything else is to forget the sheer unimaginable scale of the suffering. And now for comments. Hi, I'm from Malaysia, and I really love your videos. I was also really shocked when I started learning about our history during Japan's invasion, and it was arguably worse than the British, which was insane to me. Japan made Germany look like saints. Japan is the England of Asia.
Japan, the Israel of East Asia? No, my friend. If you look up Unit 731 and learn about the cruelty of the Japanese military, you might even end up thinking Israel was much better by comparison. In history, Japan repeatedly gambled with the lives of tens of millions of people by wars. In 663, Japan launched the Battle of Beacon and invaded Korea. In 1592 and 1597, Japan invaded Korea twice, planning to capture Beijing in 3 months and then use China as a springboard to attack India, seeking to build an Asian hegemony. The then China's Ming Dynasty sent reinforcements and Japan failed when its supply lines collapsed. In 1874, Japan shelled Korea's Galloway Island and forced Korea to sign the Treaty of Galloway. In 1894, Japan, then with a population of only 41 million, invaded China, which had a population of 430 million. Again, Japan first invaded Korea, then China, and then aimed at all of Asia. It destroyed the Chinese Qing dynasty's weakened Beiyang fleet, forced China to sign the Treaty of Shimonoseki, occupied the Liaodong Peninsula and Taiwan province, and extracted 230 million taels of silver, roughly equal to about $2 trillion today. This time Japan won its gamble. In 1904, for dominance over northeast China and Korea, Japan challenged the Russian Empire in the Far East. Japan suffered 140,000 casualties but gained rights to the South Manchuria Railway, technically a small victory. In 1910, Japan annexed Korea, another victory. From 1931 to 1945, after 3 earlier successful gambles, Japan's ambitions grew. Believing China was big but weak and could be defeated in 3 months, Japan once again gambled everything and invaded China again. The 14 years war of aggression caused 35 million Chinese casualties. In the city of Nanjing alone, Japan massacred 300,000 people in merely 6 weeks. Compared with the brutality of the Japanese army, even demons would look like angels. In 1941, because China's resistance drained Japan's resources and US-UK embargoes, Japan once again tried another desperate gamble. Without declaring war, it attacked Pearl Harbor and sank the US main battleships. In 1942, it bombed Australia, trying to cut off supply lines between the US and Australia. Australia fought bravely and Japan suffered a defeat there. There were many other countries Japan invaded or attacked: the Iraqi Kingdom, Myanmar, the Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, India, and even countries you may barely have heard of like Solomon Islands and New Guinea. Japan has a tradition of military adventurism and gambling its fate in war. Now it seems ready to gamble again. Imagine it can once more start a war with China. And of course, the old pattern remains. In Asia, it believes it must defeat China first, otherwise China will protect other countries. If Japan wins and controls Asia, it will definitely seek global dominance. And then anyone who Japan defines as inferior will no longer be treated as human. People Japan uses for life experience are called maruda, which means logs or human guinea pigs. This is what Unit 731 did. Anyone could become one of Japan's logs. In the future, if Japan were to occupy East Asia or even all of Asia, it would become an Israel multiplied by 1,000 times, and everyone in the world would become like Palestinians under Japanese rule.
This is the core of it. Is Japan the Israel of East Asia? No. As he says, if you look up Unit 731, you might think Israel was much better by comparison. And he's not wrong. Unit 731 was a covert biological and chemical warfare research unit of the Imperial Japanese Army. What they did there is the stuff of nightmares. They performed vivisections on living people without anesthesia. They infected prisoners with diseases like the plague and cholera to study their effects. They amputated limbs to study blood loss. They used people as human targets for grenades and flamethrowers. The victims, who included children, were called maruta, or logs. And the death toll? Estimates suggest that Unit 731 activities, including biological warfare attacks on Chinese cities, caused anywhere from 200,000 to 300,000 deaths. There are no documented survivors of these experiments. And then there's a Nanjing massacre. In just 6 weeks in 1937, Japanese troops murdered an estimated 300,000 civilians and unarmed soldiers. They held killing contests. They raped an estimated 20 to 80,000 women, from young girls to the elderly, and then often brutally murdered them. This is a level of barbarity that is almost without parallel. And unlike Germany, Japan has never truly reckoned with its past. High-ranking officials still visit the Yasukuni Shrine, which honors convicted war criminals. Their textbooks whitewash their history, and they deny that these atrocities even happened. And now comments. Japan, an already declining country struggling with severe demographic issues and a stagnating economy, now provoking China, which is the last thing they should be doing right now. I genuinely feel bad for the people of Japan. She needs to step down ASAP. Psychologically speaking, Japan's behavior today is primarily a result of its resentment towards China's rise. In comparison, Japan has no future. Yeah, can't ignore what Japan has done in history. So is Japan the Israel of East Asia? No. It's an insult to the victims to even make the comparison. The scale, the brutality, and the sheer sadism of Japan's imperial conquest are in a category of their own. And China will never, ever forget. They can't, because the perpetrators were never truly brought to justice. The empire was never dismantled. It just got a new coat of paint. And now, as Japan rearms and gets more aggressive in the region, China sees the ghost of the past rising again. This isn't ancient history. This is living memory. And ignoring it or minimizing it, it's a dangerous mistake. Japan is not the Israel of East Asia. It's something far, far worse. What do you think? Do you know the full extent of Japan's war crimes? Let me know in the comments below. And if you learned something today, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next video. Thanks for watching, and until next time, bye.